Americans have long seen their soul, their failures, and their triumphs through their writers. No other country has produced such a noble body of literature as the United States. Hello, I'm Jane Kasmarek, and welcome to the Great American Authors series. Between the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War that ended in 1848, America experienced an exuberant economic period of growth. It was a time of Jacksonian democracy and opportunity for all. It was a time when America solidified its economic and intellectual institutions in the Northeast. And it was during this time and from this place that American authors produced the nation's first great wave of classic literature.
Henry David Thoreau was one of 19th century America's most unusual writers. An outsider, he was known for his condemnation of American social institutions he thought immoral, and for his faith in the sanctity of nature. Thoreau was born in Concord, Massachusetts, on July 12, 1817. After graduating from Harvard in 1837, Thoreau met Ralph Waldo Emerson, who encouraged his writing, gave him work as a handyman, and taught him the philosophy of transcendentalism. Thoreau quickly joined Emerson in praising nature. In 1845, Thoreau took his faith in nature to heart when he moved to Walden Pond near Concord. Living alone for 2 years, he wrote of his observations on being in harmony with nature in his book Walden, published in 1854. Thoreau maintained his life on Walden Pond was about simple living, and he appealed to people to simplify their lives in order to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life.
Most of the luxuries and many of the so-called comforts of life are not only not indispensable, but positive hindrances to the elevation of mankind.
Walden would influence a generation of Americans in the 1960s, sparking interest in living close to the land. But it was through his celebrated essay, Civil Disobedience, that Thoreau would have his greatest impact on the world. In 1846, Thoreau refused to pay poll taxes in order to demonstrate his opposition to slavery and the Mexican-American War. So, instead of celebrating America's greatness, Thoreau's Civil Disobedience challenged the country's prejudices and social institutions, especially slavery. Here he summed up what he believed was the most important role of Americans as citizens.
I think that we should be men first and subjects afterward. It is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law so much as for the right.
In the decades that followed, civil disobedience would become a clarion call for such reformers as Leo Tolstoy, Mahatma Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr. Thoreau died in 1862. He led a remarkable life, and though he wrote only 2 books and several essays, his body of work had a tremendous influence on the course of American history.
Herman Melville and Nathaniel Hawthorne took their life experiences and initiated the long-standing tradition of writing about the dark side of the American soul.
His life was filled with contrasts. He grew up in a town steeped in the stern and cruel excesses of Puritanism, a religion that would figure heavily in his haunting stories. Yet he would embrace American transcendentalism, rejecting the faith of his forefathers. His tales probed the darker side of human nature, yet he joined the idealistic Brook Farm commune near Boston. This most celebrated and eccentric author of 19th century America was Nathaniel Hawthorne. Born on July 4, 1804 in Salem, Hawthorne attended Bowdoin College and began writing almost immediately upon graduating in 1825. His first novel, Fanshawe, was published in 1828. One of the first American writers to use America's own history as setting, Hawthorne wrote what he named romances that explored morality, sin and redemption, to show what he called the depths of our common nature. Nowhere is this more true than his brilliant 1850 novel, The Scarlet Letter. Set in Puritan Boston, The Scarlet Letter examines the suffering caused by the sin of adultery through the adulteress Hester Prynne, her lover, the minister Arthur Dimmesdale, and her husband, Roger Chillingworth. Refusing to name her lover, Hester is forced to wear the letter A and is shunned. Dimmesdale suffers greatly from the effects of his refusal to acknowledge his affair with Hester and the existence of their daughter, Pearl. His suffering spirals deeper and deeper until it consumes him. A lifelong friend of President Franklin Pierce, Hawthorne was appointed consul in Liverpool, England by Pierce in 1853. He died on May 18, 1864, while visiting New Hampshire with Pierce. He was one of 19th century America's most popular authors, but his literary masterpiece spelled the end of his popularity, and he would eventually be forced to abandon writing. Yet 30 years after his death, his fame and reputation would be restored, and his most famous book considered one of the greatest novels of all time. The author was Herman Melville, and his novel, Moby Dick. Herman Melville was born into a rich New York family on August 19, 1819. But in 1830, his father suffered severe financial losses and died. At the age of 11, Melville's life took a shattering turn into poverty. Inexperienced and ill-suited for work, he tried a variety of jobs, from clerking to teaching school. But it wasn't until he sailed aboard the Boston whaler Acushnet 11 years later that Melville found an occupation that would give him the experiences necessary to become the most popular writer of his day. For the next 3 years, Melville sailed the Pacific Ocean. Melville finally returned to the United States in 1844 after enlisting in the Navy aboard the USS United States. His adventures sailing around Cape Horn he told in his novel White Jacket, published in 1850. But his modern-day reputation rests on his allegorical masterpiece, Moby Dick. In this book, he brilliantly weaves the dangerous and often violent life aboard a whaling ship and an in-depth knowledge of whales around a symbolic tale of man striving to understand the forces of nature. Captain Ahab symbolizes the heroic struggle of man against the limitations imposed upon him by an unyielding universe, represented by the great white whale, Moby Dick.
All that most maddens and torments, all that stirs up the lees of things, all truth with malice in it, all that cracks the sinews and cakes the brain, all the subtle demonisms of life and thought, all evil to crazy Ahab, were visibly personified and made practically assailable in Moby Dick. He piled upon the whale's white hump the sum of all the general rage and hate felt by his whole race from Adam down, and then, as if his chest had been a mortar, he burst his hot heart's shell upon it. Herman Melville, Moby Dick.
But Moby Dick's dark and frightening themes scared readers, and Melville's popularity suffered. Other novels, also dark and pessimistic, followed. Sadly, in 1856, after The Confidence Man, a cynical satire on humanity, Melville gave up popular writing. From 1866 to 1886, Melville worked as Deputy Inspector of Customs in the Port of New York. He wrote short stories and poetry, sometimes published at his own expense, but he never regained the recognition as a writer that his earliest novels had given him. Melville died on September 28, 1891. His short novel, Billy Budd, a story about the battle between innocence and evil, was published in 1924 and is considered Melville's finest book after Moby Dick. It marked a resurgence in his reputation as one of America's finest writers.